Some of you might have already read part of my disclaimers. Part of it I just mentioned. I'm not an academic. This is not the result of academic research or any serious academic approach. These are my personal observations and personal reflections on the topic. Secondly, and it's part of the things that I teach is current NATO doctrine, and that is going to be my starting point for my whole discussion is current NATO doctrine. Most of the NATO documents on the topic, starting with the capstone document, Allied Joint Publication 0, NATO doctrine, have been republished 2 years ago, only 2 years ago, so that is going to be my starting point. And I'm well aware that as mentioned, I'm a Belgian infantry officer from a very small Western European NATO nation. If I would have been born in Finland or Lithuania or Austria or Italy, I would probably have a slightly different view on all these things, even though we're all Europeans. So that's going to be actually part of my message, that there's a lot of nuance involved. And then final disclaimer before I get started, those of you who have glanced through my article or maybe even just, this is a slightly shorter version, reading my title, you might think that I'm very critical of the concept or the ideas behind maneuver warfare or the maneuverist approach. Actually, far from it. I believe in most of the philosophy behind it. I am very critical, however, about the chaos that we've created in the last couple of decades when we've been using this terminology for a lot of different things. So how will I build my argument? And again, thank you to the schedulers. I'm going to start where the previous speaker left off, about 50 years ago, more or less, give or take. It's not very important that there's an actual date on there. My observations looking at NATO doctrine, heavily influenced by the US, but that's been the case for that whole period. And what I see as a practitioner is two clear periods with a very distinct doctrine, and then the last period, which is roughly where we are now, the last 10 years or so, which is much harder to determine contextually, and I will talk about what I think the problems that creates. So a lack of context is important because context is what influences and what informs doctrine, and doctrine is what allows us to draw defense plans and to develop main combat systems and weapon systems and so on, and to exercise. So if we don't have a clear doctrine, sometimes it might be because we don't have a good context. And then I'll end with what I see as three different manifestations of this lack of context, and with some very, very humble recommendations. I'm very well aware that usually doctrine writers, especially NATO doctrine writers, it's not a career field. They are officers just like me who get assigned to a job where they need to write or review doctrine. And they are or they are not supported by a network of people who are very knowledgeable, but sometimes they are not. And they do whatever they can, and then there's still all the national caveats involved in developing NATO doctrine. So I don't envy them, but I do have a couple of small recommendations. So going back roughly 50 years ago, not exactly, it's not needed, the end of the Cold War, where at some point at the NATO level, the previous speaker also talked about the British doctrine. I don't know anything about that, to be honest. But at the NATO level, at a certain moment, early 80s, NATO decided to roughly copy-paste the US air-land battle doctrine into NATO. And like I said, having a clear doctrine, this doctrine was written for this specific context, for a very specific threat, deter the Soviets, and if necessary, defend the territory of Western European NATO nations against the Soviet attack. So geographically, a very clear context as well. This is where it's going to happen. And then a clear doctrine like that, of course, that allows you to, like I said, to develop defense plans, to train those defense plans in those big reforger type exercises. Talking to predecessors of myself, a lot of them who had been stationed in Germany, they could remember annual exercises where they would go by their actual platoon and squad positions, and this is where we will be when it happens, if it happens. So a very specific preparation was possible. And then that big five, those major US-developed weapon systems that we still see in a lot of inventories today, updated, of course, several times, but we still see them around. And then all of the above, according to the people who participated and according to a lot of people at the time, maybe less and less so today, validated in 1991 in Desert Storm. So this is the doctrine we use, this is the training, this is the organization, this is the equipment. We use it against this enemy in a very, very different context, to be honest. And it supposedly it validated that doctrine of the period. Comes along the end of the Cold War, and after that, what a lot of Western European NATO nations, again, that's my perspective, what they find themselves doing is peace support operations in Europe, a lot of it in former Yugoslavia, which the fact that it is former Yugoslavia was partially triggered by the end of the Cold War, also in some African countries. And what we observe is we keep using that same equipment, especially initially, those tracked vehicles, and again, with a caveat, we start using them differently over time. Personally, I was in KFOR twice, with 6 years in between. Initially, we still had Belgian tanks on the border crossing point looking into Serbia. We were doing our movements with our tracked infantry fighting vehicles. 6 years later, the tanks were gone, back to Belgium. Those infantry fighting vehicles, we still had them in theater, but they were almost locked up, and we took them out maybe once every other month just to make sure the vehicle was still running and the driver still knew how to drive it. But initially we're using that same equipment, but the mindset is very different. Again, my personal observations. People were talking in terms like these are UN procedures, UN TTPs, the UN checkpoints, show the flag, crowd and riot control. So the mindset was this is not normal war, this is a very specific context, this is something different that we're doing now. And then a final observation about that period is that the level of violence that our own forces were subjected to, I'm not talking about the levels of violence between ethnic groups in Rwanda in '94, I'm talking about what our own forces are subjected to. It's quite limited. Numbers of casualties are rather low. The bottom picture is for Belgians, is a very important picture. This is Kigali, '94, where 10 Belgian soldiers are killed. But again, they are killed using small arms, fire, and even machetes. Very big political impact in Belgium. My Dutch colleagues have a similar event a year later. The French, a year later, they retake a bridge around Sarajevo with a bayonet charge. So, with 2 platoons. So we're not talking about corps level maneuvering, about fire support using artillery. We're talking about small arms and even edged weapons. So very, very limited violence that we are subjected to, and that is going to influence the expectation management back home. People are no longer used to body bags. And then, of course, this happens. Like most people, I still know where I was. I was just back from my first deployment in Kosovo. Big first caveat here is that this does not mean all those other missions, they don't end. KFOR is still there. But the focus shifts in a dramatic way. And it turns more or less to something like this, which is something we have known for the last 20 or so years. Basically focused around 2 countries only, Afghanistan, Iraq. This is what Western countries, NATO countries, operational experience, operational memory of the last 20 years, this is what it's all about, these 2 countries. Higher levels of violence, but still at low echelons. We don't see brigades and divisions fighting. We see platoons or smaller than platoons even, maybe companies now and then, but still at a very low level, with a higher level of violence. That reality that drives us to develop a new doctrine, and that is, in my perception, the big change when I confront this to the decade before that, the peace support operations. That was viewed as this is a specific situation. This is not the normal way we do things. This was perceived as this is the new normal. Those people who had at the highlight is the wrong word, but had at the apex of their career, Desert Storm, they didn't know what real war was. They only fought for 100 hours. That is not war. This was a protracted thing. We're talking about decades here. So people who were practitioners in that time, they perceived this as the new normal, and doctrine was written before it. So this is, of course, the US Field Manual 3-24, published in 2006, but which, again, heavily influenced NATO doctrine, AJP 344, AJP 327 now, I think. So, to my point, again, a first period with a very clear context to doctrine is the Cold War. We developed even major weapon systems for it. Now we have a period where the new normal, according to the practitioners of the time, we developed doctrine for it. At a certain moment, we even see that development of specific equipment as well. MRAPs, mine-resistant vehicles, and so on. And in the certain countries, and Belgium should definitely look in the mirror when it comes to that, we see organizational tables and standard equipment of units starting to evolve. In that period, Belgium got rid of all its tracked vehicles, and we completely switched to wheeled vehicles with a very high focus on mine resistance, because this is what we were thinking about. This was the context that was driving our doctrine, our equipment, our organization, and our training. And then the final period, which this is too short, I should probably say the return of military peer-to-peer conflict. To be honest, if I look at this, if you ask me today what should be the context, the overarching context for our doctrine development, I don't really know. Is it artificial islands? Is it Houthi militias targeting commercial shipping? Is it border problems with Russia? Is it A2AD around Kaliningrad? Is it turtle tanks and cheap drones and trench warfare in Ukraine? And again, I would come back to what I said earlier, where you sit is where you stand. Your perspective is driven by your geographical location and the position of your country in the world. If we would ask a United States Marine stationed in Japan what the context is, he would give a radically different answer than the Norwegian conscript guarding the Russian border, or than the German soldier training Ukrainian counterparts for the war in Ukraine. So they would all give a very, very different answer to that question, what is the context? And we don't stop thinking. The US Army initially came up with a pamphlet about multi-domain operations. NATO, like previous US developments, has incorporated that into NATO doctrine. But to be honest, it does not help me as a practitioner, this. Maybe at the joint level, but right now, when I look at division and below, this does not really help me understand what it is that I'm doing and why. The way I see this manifested is, first of all, and Tom has mentioned a lot of the slogan type words related to maneuver warfare. Previous speakers have put up definitions. But even if I go back to my reference, which is current NATO doctrine, there is no clear definition in there. The NATO doctrine, some of the documents even slightly contradict each other. Some of them, they talk about a very physical way of maneuvering, movement relative to the enemy, trying to get a positional advantage, some of them talk about attacking, understanding will and cohesion, which sounds very nice. Some of them talk about giving the enemy multiple dilemmas, attacking or disruption and disorganization of the enemy. But that's just those couple of NATO doctrinal documents that are supposed to be informing our practice today. And they don't even have a clear answer. A lot of the times, in a lot of writing, even in the doctrine, but especially just professional journals and so on, maneuver gets contrasted to attrition. Previous speakers have talked about that as well. And that's why I started, the question I had was, well, when we talk about maneuver is better than attrition, but because that's mostly what we say, it's always better. What is the doctrinal context? What is the level of warfare where we do that comparison? So that's my second bullet. I started to look at, again, in the doctrine, but in other writings as well, I was looking for where is that comparison made? Because as Tom's questionnaire, he specified in the questions, we're talking about the strategic level, we're talking about the operational level, and that is relevant, that addition. So of course, I started out with strategic, operational, tactical. I thought, well, maybe it's also in military theory, so I added that. And not very doctrinally correct, but below the tactical level, I added something that I would call gut feeling, a procedural level, where we go down to the level of what some countries call battle drills, something that is really very low level. This is almost reflexive. This is what we do in such a scenario. So starting out with military theory, a lot of countries publish lists with principles of war. Some say principles of warfare, two different things, but I'm using war because that's the most important reference for my article. And in a lot of these lists, you see maneuver, and some people even debate if that's the correct term. You never find attrition as a principle of war. So to me, that's check, one level down. This is not the doctrinal context where you can do the comparison. So I go one down, I go to strategy. Some people write about, there are only 2 strategies. Some write about 3 strategies. Some go all the way up to lists of 10. Almost every time, attrition is one of the potential strategies. Maneuver never is. So again, I come up with this level where, okay, I cannot make that comparison here. So I go on down. It's the operational level. It's where we draw our campaign frameworks with our lines of effort and our decisive conditions, and we attack the enemy's center of gravity. Usually, in most NATO exercises, we like to attack the enemy center of gravity in an indirect way. We don't really use the terminology maneuver or attrition, but I would say an indirect approach of attacking is more towards the maneuver side of things, less towards attrition. So it doesn't really allow for a comparison either, although what is strange is that usually campaign framework, decisive conditions, we work towards those by trying to achieve operational effects. Operational effects, we work towards those through operational actions, and well, how do we measure those? Sometimes that is about numbers. Sometimes there is a link to attrition. So the tactical level, my reference was the ATP 112, which is basically the list of task verbs. Maneuver is not a task verb. Attrit is not a task verb. Attrit is even specifically mentioned as this is not a task verb. So the closest you get, I think, is support by fire, which is the definition is something like supporting a maneuvering force, but then we're really only talking about physical movement. And then at that very basic procedural level, the level of a squad doing battle drills, fire and maneuver is a term that's used in some countries for a unit splitting up, and part of it is moving towards or away from the enemy, and the other ones are firing to support that movement, cover the movement. But we definitely don't talk about attrition. So, and then finally, what I see, and I think we're going to hear a lot more of that in the rest of the week, what I see is we so like the terminology of maneuver warfare and maneuverist approach that we're starting to use it everywhere. So we use it in all kinds of domains, of none of which I'm an expert in: time, space, cyber, cognitive domain. And again, with all due respect, but I think it's not helpful, because I think, one, it's adding to the overall confusion. Two, I think it's doing a disservice to those domains. I think they would be better served with a terminology developed for that domain than to just copy-paste something, and usually without the context again. So they'll say, this is the smart approach, but they won't discuss the less smart approach. And then finally, if you start using a term to everything, in the end, it just loses its meaning, I think. It becomes sort of a bland, it discovers everything, maneuverist approach. So I'm not sure how we are on time, but I'll end with my very humble recommendations to future doctrine writers. Who knows, I might be one someday. First of all, I think it would be useful, because NATO has been, if we go back 10 years, NATO was publishing different doctrinal publications in a rather unsynchronized way. So sometimes the lower level publication was updated before the higher level publication, so that sometimes that created some ambiguity, because we were even changing numbers of joint functions and so on. So I think it would be very useful to reconsider the whole set and all the echelons and say, okay, what do we understand as maneuver warfare, and should we maybe find another terminology for another domain? The Verhaeghe in his keynote, he spoke about system disruption approach, which would I like it. It could be a potential term for something at maybe a higher level echelon. But I think it would be very useful for everybody to have like a coherent set of definitions. Secondly, I think we cannot write doctrine and say, well, that conflict that's ongoing there, that's an exception to the rule. We're writing our doctrine for real war, and that's something else. So it doesn't really apply. Only future historians will know what's the exception to the rule, I think. And then thirdly, I already mentioned it, we really like this terminology. We're a little bit enamored with it. I think we should stop doing that. We should stop being, or using our emotion when we write doctrine, and maybe be much more rigorous. Because maneuver is a smarter approach, and who doesn't want to be smart? So we will pick the maneuverist approach. Maneuver is innovative, and it's thinking out of the box, and it's surprising and spectacular. So who doesn't want to be the military commander who did a spectacular maneuver and won the battle or the war and got a street named after him and a statue in the square and a lecture hall maybe named after him? And finally, and very important, I think, when we talk to our civilian constituency, it has the aura of being cleaner. I think some people envision maneuverist approach as, well, we'll do turns around the enemy and we'll dazzle him and he'll be so confused that he'll give up. And there's no blood involved, definitely not on our side, but almost no blood on his side either, because we're just so we've just confused him into surrender. So of course I can see the appeal, but it's not realistic. I think if anything, current conflicts are showing us that it's not realistic. So with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention and hand over the floor to the Master of Ceremony.